Ladies and gentlemen, the National Institute of Art History and the Château of Fontainebleau are happy to welcome you at this 9th edition of the Art Festival. And we will continue our debates with the one on new museums and their room in contemporary society with Tone Hansen, Stein, Olav, and Jeanette Varberg.
There. We will be speaking in English, but I know some of you have this genius headgear on. And my name is Jeanette Varberg, and I'm a curator from the National Museum in Denmark. But before that, I was working at another museum I was working in a museum called Museumet in Aarhus, also in Denmark. And it was, I have been working for more than 12 years with rethinking museums and how we can rebuild them. And this is the building when it was new. This was the old one. And you may know it also from France that normally when I'm an archaeologist, and what I exhibit is cultural history. And you normally find old buildings to house old things. But then you cannot make modern exhibitions. And that was what I was working with. And what we had was this building instead, built by the Henrichsen's architects. To make it as open-minded as possible, it was thought as a democratic house, because it's important to have something for the public to spend their time, not only to see the museum, but the surroundings is also very important. You can see the Sea of Kattegat just in the right of the building. And we had the... we should make 4,850 square meters of exhibitions from scratch in a new museum hall. And there was a lot of thoughts going through our mind when we did this. We had a totally free space. Instead of narrow hallways, we had a big open space where we had to make a big exhibition. And as we were historians and archaeologists, we decided that the human should be in the center. Everything should have a human face or surrounded about human life in order for the public to have some kind of recognition. And also, we had to inspire curiosity. This is a living child. This is my son. And beside him you have Lucy, who is one of the oldest hominids, 3.2 million years old, and the first hominin to stand on 2 feet. And this sculpture was made by really skillful artists from Holland called the Kennis brothers. And it was we wanted to make the past come to life in a new way, because when you just have the artifacts from past times, it's hard to see who used them. So that's one of the things that we were working with in this museum. And we wanted to be for 3 generations, so we don't have these kinds of audio guides. Everything is integrated, so if you want to listen, you can listen 2 at a time, because it's really important to have grandparents, parents and children to engage when they go through the exhibitions. And that's why we also aspire to playfulness. To play and to interact with the past is really important. And also in the ethnographic exhibitions, This is just we technology. It's not rocket science, but it worked. It's working. We also had touchscreens with interactions where you can see researchers telling about their research. And in that point, we also decided to have something for the children. And yes, it's me with a hat in there, trying to explain the Bronze Age for children and to inspire. And we also had reconstructions of old skeletons that from important graves. This is a 3,300-year-old Bronze Age woman who was found in a tomb in Denmark, and she had some kind of strange look at her. It's a modeler, an artist called Oscar Nilsson from Sweden who made her. And something really fascinating arises when you can look the skeleton in the eye and see a human being. And that is also what I think it's most important when you talk about cultural history now. It's also to be able to identify yourself with our past, because we have such a long history. But if it's not disseminated or shown properly, you don't really feel the significance of the time we have been on Earth. And that's also why we had we exhibited the family, not as a family tree, not a line of evolution, but a tree of different kinds of humans from the last 3 million years were made. And we had some trouble because you can see the female holding a spear. She turned out with a DNA examination that she was actually a man. That made some problems, but she's still shown as a woman, and we just have a small sign saying, "Oops, she was a man," but that's just how it is. And we also had animated, like stepping outside, inside a battlefield. And this museum has been visited for more than 1 million people in the 5 years that they have been opened. And now this was made, it was completed, it was opened. So now I have the new task, and it's in the National Museum of Denmark, just on the opposite side of the Parliament. And here we have a very, very traditional exhibition. And actually we have 6 kilometers of hallways of exhibition in this building. 6 kilometers of walking, if you take everything, and 250,000 artifacts on exhibition. And we have to rebuild that as well. But here we have some problems, because in Aarhus you had a field just beside the museum. In the middle of Copenhagen there's nothing you can do. So you have a problem. We have started a little bit by making the exhibition, just giving them a kind of a makeover. And just by making this makeover, we actually got more than double as many visitors for 3 hall rooms, exhibition rooms. But actually in the future, this part of the museum we plan to somehow to rebuild, but we have to go deep in ground or up in the air for us to able to make this exhibition. So that's a new task. But what I will say is that when I, as an archaeologist, talk about the past, I often get the question, what is it worth, all of this old ceramics and bowls and stuff, all those old stuff? How can it be any relevance for the society? And every time I say that, if you don't know your roots, if you don't know your history, you don't know where you come from, you have no idea where you're going in the past. And I think some of the most important things that we can do as a museum when we are starting to plan new is to look at what kind of topics that are relevant for the society today. Topics like climate, migration, warfare, what kind of society do we want to have in the future? And look back, because in the Stone Age, when we were hunter-gatherers, we only worked 3 hours a day. The rest was spare time. I would like to discuss how we get back to being like in the Stone Age, because I think I work way too much. And that is what a museum can. You can have some relevant discussions, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, so let's do that. I'm from the Munchmuseet in Oslo, which is a single artist museum. And in a few minutes, I'm going to show you a 3-minute animation of how it will be to get into the new museum. It's going to open next year in May, and it's a much more modern museum than what we have today. But the task of this discussion is what role, what place does the new museums take in the development of society? And I think there is 2 things I'd like to say before we see the animation. One is there is a lot of development of infrastructure in the arts. We are building new museums in Oslo, but there are new museums being built almost everywhere. And if you look at the Middle East, there is a lot of new infrastructure in the arts, a lot of exhibitions. If you look at China, there is 300 museums being built, opened every year. So it's a lot of development of the arts worldwide. That's one interesting aspect. The second thing I would like to say introductionary is museums have a very high credibility. If you compare to political environments, if you compare to media, museums have the highest credibility of every other part of society. So how do we deal with that credibility in a world where it's even more important than ever to participate in the development of society, in the development of the big questions and challenges that Jeanette just mentioned? How can we contribute to a better world, to better lives locally, but also globally? So that's, I think, is one of the crucial aspects of running a museum today. How can we participate in solving the most important challenges that society faces right now? But before I go further into that, I'd like to show you that we are building a new museum in Oslo, and it's going to be a new museum for the big collection of Edvard Munch that we are responsible for, which is 28,000 artworks by Edvard Munch, which is 2/3 of his total production, which was 40,000 artworks. And of course, we are going to do this museum showing Edvard Munch, but also showing contemporary art and showing other artists and doing a wide program of other activities. And our aim, of course, is to create reflection, knowledge, art experiences, and this is what we are building. So let's see if we can get this to work. Maybe I get some assistance. Let's have a look.
You did run. You did work, yes. Oh, sorry.
So the new museum is being built on the seashore in the center of Oslo. And if you see to the left, it's the Opera House. And this is a new Munch museum. It's 30 floors high. It's going to be 11 spaces for art, exhibitions, and another 4 places for other activities like artist talks, concerts, performances, seminars, conferences, and so forth.
And some jazz music we can hear.
This is Spanish architect music taste. The Spanish architect, by the way, is Juan Herreros from Madrid. And this museum is to be opened in May next year. And we've had a very good collaboration with the architect. And we think that we are receiving everything that we were dreaming about. So it's going to be a very modern museum in every sense. A lot of space for children's activities, for research, for library, for exhibitions, for other activities, for a fantastic view of Oslo, and for restaurants, cafe, coffee bar. This is one of the monumental spaces. All the exhibition spaces are different in size and height. Of course, when we have 28,000 artworks by Edvard Munch, we can do exhibitions all over the world, and that is our vision, to enrich people's lives with Edvard Munch all over the world. And right now we are having an exhibition in London at the British Museum. We are having another extensive exhibition in Moscow at the Tretjakov Gallery. And we are opening 2 days ago a huge exhibition in Saudi Arabia, in Daman. As far as I know, it's the first figurative exhibition in Saudi Arabia since Muhammad. And we're opening this year also a big exhibition in Düsseldorf connected to the Frankfurt Book Fair. So there's a lot of exhibitions outside of Norway. I don't know if any of you were at our exhibition, the L'Œil Moderne, at the Centre Pompidou a few years back. There was 500,000 people experiencing that exhibition, and that was the reason why it was 500,000 people was because there was no more space. It was a line from the morning to the evening every day. So if you don't have travel plans for next year, I hope I will see you all in Oslo in May, June, or July. I don't know when you have holiday. It's going to be a great city. And also in October, there is a new national museum to be opened. So there is 4 major museums of art in Oslo. It's Henie Onstad Center, which is Tone Hansen on my left, who is director. There is Astrup Fearnley, which is a private museum, but a very fine contemporary art program. And then there's a Munch Museum and the National Museum. So it's a lot to look forward to. So that was a small introduction to our new museum. And then I'll pass the word to Tone here, and then we can discuss a little bit further about the position of new museums in the development of society.
Thank you. We're just going to get up one slide from my presentation an hour ago, just to give you a context for those of you who were not here. And so I'm the museum director of the Henie Onstad Art Center, or Kunstcenter as we like to call it. And pardon me for those of you who were here an hour earlier, because I'm going to repeat a little bit of the information I gave there. So the Henie Onstad opened in 1968. That is 10 years after the Moderna Museet, no, 10 years after the Louisiana Museum, and the Moderna Museet opened a little bit before that. And although those 2 museums were groundbreaking, a lot of things happened in those 10 years in between. And the museum, when it opened in 1968, was built very much upon a model that was already established. That's how fast things actually changes within a museum. At least since then, I mean, even though they created a big change in the 60s, I think that we are facing a new shift in paradigm when it comes to the role of the museum. And I think what you could say, that if you look at the facade of the Henie Onstad here, you can see that it's hardly any signs telling you where the entrance is. It's a museum that reflects its surroundings. It's built upon a human scale. There's no thresholds. The surface is equal if you're inside or outside the museum facade glass. So you're supposed to go in and be at home. The scale should be almost as being at home. Ceilings are low. It's a warm and welcoming atmosphere, or so it was thought, as an opposition to the more dramatic column-based big institutions that you would have, like the National Galleries around. Also, of course, influential is the Pompidou, that has at least had several entrances that you could actually open and go in very many and into very many functions. You would have a museum that wouldn't actually have one entrance but many. And that is, you know, a philosophy for a museum that says that anything can happen here and that you are welcome to stay within this framework. I would say running a museum that is 50 years old, built out of concrete, still needs a lot of maintenance. So while the others in Oslo are building new museums that are tremendously expensive, I spend a lot of money on restoration, and which is dramatically needed. And you can think, in 1968, the Henie opened as a quite bourgeoisie museum, high-quality stone, fixed rooms, teak interior, red carpets, velvet curtains, within a beautiful surrounding, and it was seen as something in opposition to the 68 uproar. So you had a conflict outside of the museum, although it wasn't really reflected within the program because the program was really radical. So I would say that you can build whatever you want to build and what is needed to build because you have to gain more space for the audience just as much as for the collection. But the one important thing in a museum, except for the collection, which is the core thing we're working on, is the people working there. And now there's a wedding outside, I think. There's someone. So we always have to work with the people working in the museum and to be able to reflect upon the society we work with. And I think that if you look at the Munch Museum, who's now moving from one premise to another, I think that's been exemplaric in its way of dealing with its past while moving into something new and bringing the past with you while doing a program still, you know, in between the old and the new. And I think that is incredibly important for the trust that you're talking about in a museum. Because how do you build trust for a new building unless you bring your history with you?
Yes, exactly. And when we decided to build a new museum for the Munch collection, it was because the old museum is built in the post-war economy, quite small, not very good conditions for the visiting audience. So it was really necessary to build a better museum, a more modern museum, and a larger museum, because we also wanted to do a lot more than presenting Edvard Munch. And these single artist museums can sometimes turn into mausoleums, where the artist is not actually considered and being perceived as an artist, but more like a culture object. So in Norway, I mentioned earlier today that when I came to the Munch Museum, I discovered that in the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, which is about the same size as Oslo, people were visiting their museum every 3.5 years in average. So every 3.5 years in average, people came back to the museum. At the Munch Museum, the Oslo citizens came back to the museum every 35 years in average. Well, that's twice in your lifetime. So the first time is when you are at school and people drag you in. And the second time is when you have visitors from America or France or somebody that you want to show this famous artist. So we really needed to recreate Edvard Munch as an artist and not as a culture historic object. And also his art, of course, to re-explain to people that this is art, it has relevance, and we had to change the whole programming of the museum. But anyway, I think that when we decided to move, we have now an exhibition called Exit, where we go through almost 60 years of history at the old museum. And we have another project called the Munch Museum on the Move, where we are actually doing outdoor projects, sometimes indoor, but outside of our museum, in trams, in buses, in squares, in other cultural institutions. Right now there is an art project in the opera, which is the next door neighbor in the new museum. So we wanted to invite artists from the local environment to participate in this movement from the old to the new museum. And in this environment there is a lot of immigrant cultures coming to Norway. So it's very important that we also, talking about developing society, that we want to include artists from different cultures, from different voices, and trying to be part of this enormous challenge that we have in migration today. That's not the only challenge, but that's one of the enormous challenges that we have. So I think that it's very important, as I said earlier, to be relevant and to participate in solving the most important problems. So migration is one, environment is one, security is one. People feel insecure about a lot of things, particularly maybe the migration, about the future, about artificial intelligence. And we need to do something about how people react to globalization. There's a lot of nationalism going on, there's a lot of popularism going on. How can we preserve a good global family despite all this angst that we can see in certain countries and in certain environments? So I think that's a very important part for our museum and for all museums to take care of. And the good thing, and the good news about that is that I think there is a lot of collaboration between museums in the world. We do exhibitions in China, in Russia, in Saudi Arabia, I just mentioned, of course in America, in England, all over the place. And there is a lot of interaction between museums. So there's a lot of possibility to promote art, to promote artists, to create reflection, to create knowledge, to create artistic activity and expression in all kinds of fashions. So I think we have big possibilities and we need to take the opportunity to participate in the development of how the world is moving forward. And we have lots of challenges now, also in our democracies.
Jeanette, you were talking about the Democratic Museum. I was so curious about hearing about that in terms of education, because of course you work with a very different kind of museum than we do. A contemporary museum like mine do changing exhibitions all the time, while you work with exhibitions that might, be presented for very many years. Mm-hmm. And of course you have a challenge in terms of many technical things, but also the story you tell has to bear through for many years. So how do you work with that, and how do you define this democratic museum?
Well, when we talk about the democratic museum, we want to open up for everybody. And that is also something we have to work with, is how we engage with the public, because we have the same ways of displaying our artifacts in a very tasteful, meaningful for us way, but sometimes you have to make some exhibitions in a way that is not speaking to us as colleagues, but to a third of the public who never comes to our museum. And we try to do that with working together with a very controversial artist in Denmark, who some love him and some hate him, and he is just absolutely crazy with the Vikings. And he's an extremely talented photographer and scenographer. So we invited him in as an artist in a cultural history museum to present his idea of Vikings. And it created really a shitstorm in the press. And people were talking about it, and there were opinions, and suddenly it was a really, really small exhibition and a small budget. But suddenly we were looking at this, okay, we had to stand through this shitstorm and make a lot of analyses. So we had a lot of people standing asking the public, and suddenly we saw all of these people who never ever comes into our exhibitions halls, suddenly they were there. And they had an opinion, and we asked them, why are you coming? They said, we wanted to see if we agreed with Jim Lyngvild, as his name is. And
Did they agree?
most of them actually did. And what we created a discussion about the past and how we show the Vikings, show the past. It's something that interests the Danes. And we made it as a topic that you discuss with your family when you are eating supper or something like that. It's a thing they were talking about, and suddenly everybody wanted to see for their own eyes because they had an opinion. And I don't think that our colleagues said that we should not have invited him in, but suddenly we made it open up for a part of the public who never comes. And they were like, oh, it's actually really nice to be at a museum. And we asked them, when have you been here last? And it was 20 years ago, you know. and I think that we should have some courage sometimes also for a cultural history museum to invite in artists who have a little bit of provocation and to make museums matter when ordinary people discuss who they are and what kind of society they want. And sometimes you just have to try and then say, okay, I will stand through a shitstorm in 1 month, and then we have to look. And you ask for another question in how we make these exhibitions worth while when they stand for years and years. We're working on a new model now where we have a basic where you can see all of the, you know, when you are a cultural history museum, archaeology museum, you just have to show some things. And there are some things that are very famous, so you have to be there. But then you have another layer of like when you have special exhibitions that can be changed, and that is what the new technology can do for you.
Yep.
So kind of like, can we say that I'm building the Netflix for museums kind of thing? So you can have one exhibition going on for 1 year and then you can change. And maybe somewhere in the future you can change for yourself. We're working on that.
Yeah, so the audience themselves can change.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I think, I mean, Stein, Olav and I have discussed this previously, and I'm going to give the microphone back to you soon, but I was just thinking of this, the role of technology within a museum, because that's also changing the building as such, I would guess. I mean, I work with 50-year-old stone buildings, so it's not that we're going to find any fiber optics in that anytime soon, because it's complicated, but still, you have the possibility of thinking about the future within the building itself, so that the building can cope with the development. I mean, we're so used to the white cube that it's a recently new technology for exhibiting art as well, and now we have the black cube, and that has become a pretty normal way of presenting art, because you show art, there's films, there's video, there are installations, there are multimedia, they're all black spaces, black rooms, and then you enter into the augmented reality and VR, and the world as such is in your head, or what is presented within a box in your head, and that also changes the museum completely. And of course it's a challenge whether or not it's an old or a new museum to figure how to deal with this new technology, but also to understand how do we create an audience, or how do we co-opt with the audience development, because the kids today, they can't even handwrite. They have learned this movement, you know.
Yeah.
They see a painting and they think, where's next? So how do we meet with that kind of it's also a knowledge. It's a new technology. It's forming a new body for people. So how do the museum meet with that challenge? If we've done a survey with the kids visiting our museum, and they say it's boring because there's no sound. Things move too slow, and there's no sound. And okay, they can move faster themselves, and maybe they will experience things faster, I don't know, but it's interesting to listen to them and to get their feedback. And as a museum director, I had a meeting with an e-sport developer. And some of you might know what an e-sport is. It's actually gaming. It's organized gaming as competition. They had a FIFA festival at the or end game at the Ullevål Stadion, which is the football stadion, and they were playing games. Some of the best are really, really very well paid, and they have followers. You can make events with them. It's not that the kids are sitting in their basements playing; they're actually out there They organize concerts within the games. They organize live events where people are playing and you yourself can play. And my ideal museum in the future is, of course, not the building as such, but the people working in the museum that can actually make a platform where it's possible for the grandmother, who's the usual, visitor at my museum, 60 plus, with her grandchild learning something from each other. She might learn what a game is. And he can teach her, and you will have different kinds of exchange of knowledge. And I think that's going to challenge the museums in the future, that knowledge is not necessarily with us, it's also within the audience. And that's also why we have to kind of challenge the paradox that, or the situation that we see now, that the museums we're building are so expensive that are going to have to be very commercially driven because you have to make money. So how do you combine those two things? And that's a question for both of you, I guess. So Olav, you're getting the mic back.
No, I think Henie Onstad Center with Tone here has done some really, really wonderful things, bringing in new audiences through different activities that you wouldn't actually suppose would happening in a museum. And I also like very much what you told us about bringing in an artist and trying to connect to the contemporary art, and through that also, let's say, establish a contemporary discussion that were relevant to a lot of people. And I think that, for example, we are building new museums in Oslo, but we are working very well together to develop more interest in art and more activity in the art. But of course, 65% of our population in Norway do not use the art museums. And this is not only Norway, this is Europe. This is America. Most places in the world, in the, let's say, free world, there is 65% doesn't use the visual art museums. So how do we develop a possibility to create more interest? One tool that is coming now is the digital world, certainly. You have the Z generation, they spend 50% of their time not sleeping on digital media. You have the rest of the world that you would like to reach. And I was thinking sometimes that when I grew up, I was taking the train to my school and people were reading the newspaper. And in Oslo there was maybe 8 or 10 newspapers, and they were all competing to get people to buy their newspaper. But today when I go to work on my tram, there is no newspapers, everybody has their phones. But the local newspapers are not competing locally anymore. They're competing with people sitting in these trams, reading the New York Times, Frankfurt Allgemeine, Guardian. So now the local competition that was there when I grew up is disappeared. Today, the competition is between these media and the rest of the world. And that's going to happen also with the museum world. We haven't actually seen how we can develop our, let's say, business models, or how we can actually develop our global activity in digital media. But two things is happening. We can reach out to everybody through internet and social media, and we can also reach out to the world with digital projects happening physically. So let's say now, for example, the Van Gogh Museum is doing a lot of exhibitions which are digital, no original artwork in China, and they have huge people coming, huge crowds coming to their exhibitions. And last year you had in Paris this Galerie Lumière. It was, I think, quite banal in its content, but technology was interesting, and they had 1 million people in 6 months. There was 1 million people that didn't get in. They made 10 million income, 10 million euro in 6 months. Which museum in Paris makes 10 million euro in 6 months? None. Even with 1 million people going to Louvre last year, there is no museum with that kind of income. So this is happening. Today, it's not part of the museum world. It's commercial companies that are dealing with Van Gogh exhibition everywhere, sometimes Munch, sometimes others. But in the future, we have to take that place, and we have to create also knowledge and reflection and substantial quality art in digital media to reach out to the rest of the world and to reach out to the younger generations. And that's why I think it was very interesting. Also, you said that you were concerned with the digital world and how you you are on track to get into that.
Yeah, but still, I'm an archaeologist, so the artifact, the object, will always be in the center, and it's how we unfold that. So when we are talking about the digital world, it's in connection in the same room as the object. Because you can never, you can have 3D rendering of the objects and pictures, but still it's the museum, one of the oldest foundations of the museum is still the fascination of standing face to face to an object that is old or is something totally unique. And in the National Museum, we have these very, very old objects. And for me, they are the most important thing. I'm old-fashioned in that way, but I have to keep up pace, as we say. So we have to unfold and unravel the histories, but I'm working very focused on doing that in the museum space. How can we take and unwrap the story of the object? Because the thing is, when I go through the museum and I stand before a sword, I have the whole story about the person holding the sword in the hand, what kind of society, everything. But I have been in this business for almost 20 years. So I have this imagination. You have to give that kind of knowledge to your audience in a way that is is intuitive, I think. I think that's how we work, that it's easygoing, that you don't have to read, because that's also one of the things when you say with the newspapers and sitting with it. Now, audience is not used to read text anymore in the same way. They want to experience things. So you have to some kind of transform the text and the knowledge beside the objects and turn them into something you can look at or experience in films, in virtual reality, whatever you can. So we have to find out how to make the story fascinate and knowledge fascinate inside the room, the exhibition hall.
And sometimes a sword is just a sword. And it's beautiful because it's that. It's also the possibility of, creating your own story by looking at that sword or an axe.
Not really.
No? Well, in the art world, I would absolutely argue for that. We could put a sword in the exhibition and it would become something completely else than within your framework, of course. And that's also interesting. What kind of typology are we actually working with? What kind of machine is a museum? What does it say from the outside to the inside? I was just thinking of slowing down time. How do we make people slow down then? If they're so looking for ways of getting stimulated while not having to do much themselves, how can we create spaces that actually makes people slow down? Even if it takes 6 kilometers to get through the museum in a hurry, how do you make that happen? And I think that's some of the challenge today within the museum. And we did one project last year that was highly popular, and that was with the performance artist Marina Abramovic. And she set up this workshop where you had to walk down the stairs, you had to walk into a room, you had to leave all your belongings, like this, time stealer, keys, any kind of watches, any kind of elements that could give you any sense of time, you had to leave in a locker. And then you had to go into another room and you had to look at an instruction video that actually is some kind of exercises, pretty much what a singer would do before they go on stage. Moving your face, your arms, doing things that you necessarily don't do in a museum, and certainly not in front of people. But it was a dark room, so you could stand there and do this exercise in order to prepare before you went down even one more stair, and you would enter a room with beds, with just colors on the walls. And you could sit down and look at a color for as long as you wanted. And it was one station, and I tested it, and that was slow walking. And for me, it was impossible to walk as slow as Marina Abramovich wanted me to do. There was no cell in my body that was able to slow down as much as she demanded of me. And you could also sit down and count rice, and separate rice, brown and black rice, which is a ridiculous thing to do. But if you do something ridiculous in 10 minutes, something happens to you, your mind, your way of reflection. So I'm just curious about how can we create a museum that can do that and still do a Pipilotti Rister or a Yayoi Kusama crazy, involving our exhibition that, stimulates all your senses at once, so you get like the candy experience as well. How do we create a museum that can do that?
Well, I would say I disagree, and to some extent I agree, because I think it's nice to have people experiencing art originally, objects originally. You cannot touch the art objects anymore, but you can probably touch some other artist artifacts.
You can touch the
I'd like to hear some opinions from you, because I think that if I decide to only have people coming to my museum, it's going to be a minority locally. It's going to be a minority globally, for sure. And when I want to enrich people's lives with art all over the world, with Edvard Munch and his art and other artists, I really want to reach out to the rest of the world. And I can reach out, promote art, promote artists, promote reflection, promote knowledge, use our power as art institutions to create a better world, not only for the people coming to our museum, but also for the rest of the world and for the younger generations that doesn't necessarily come. So I want to continue work with the minority coming to the museum, but I really want to reach out to everybody that doesn't come to the museum. So should we get some questions? So do you have any opinions on this? Does anybody want to have a question or give an opinion on the discussion of, somebody in the back? Great. Okay, you can say who you are and what's your question?
It's not a question. It's about what you said on not touching the objects. There are several museums in France today that are doing exhibition with not the real object, but copies. And you can touch them. There is an exhibition in Lyon currently. And you can touch, and they try to make it the best way and add some stuff to give you the impression that you touch marble or things like this.
Great. So, Jeanette, you want to start having people touch your objects?
The axe. Come on, let us use the axes.
Of course, the stone axes, we have thousands, so no problem. And I think we actually had in the prior museum in Moscow, we had copies for people to touch, and also original objects, not out in the exhibition, but in children's programs where they always could touch these things. I think it's a good idea to try to have this hands-on and not be afraid of putting something precious out in the public, because we had the experience that if there's something really valuable and you can, as an audience, touch it, you value it and you don't ruin it. So people kind of protecting it, that they know that it's something special, that they can touch this, and it's so old. And I think that's really wonderful to see, that not everybody just wants to destroy everything, but they take care. And in the National Museum in Denmark, we also have a big skeleton of not an axe, but an ox. And we only had one small incident with a small boy wanted to play with it, and it broke a little bit. But it can be fixed again. So still, it's out in the audience, and I think it creates something magical. So it's a great idea about the touching part. I think I will bring it back home with me. So maybe you can touch a Viking sword soon.
I mean, the saddest thing about entering a museum is that you have these warning signs: no photos, no touching, no drinking, no running, no. You have all these kind of disciplinary signs before you enter. And for children, of course, that's incredibly boring. It's all you want to do. But you can't touch a Munch painting. But you can be touched by it. And I think that's essential for a painting of Munch is to be in front of it live.
Absolutely, and I think that I will have some more questions. I just want to say one thing. 10% of the visitors to the Munchmuseum touch the art. Why is that? Because they want to find out, is there a glass on the painting? Or is it not? Because they can't see it. Okay, reflect on that. Any more questions from the... Okay, good.
It's not a question, but all the question you raised in the situation of do we have to have people come and see the object, which is different from the virtual life that we live all the time, the younger live more than we do. But as you said, the specificity of the museum and the objects or work of art that we have are unique, and I think it would be a pity not to have them have this experience and invent something so that they would like to have it. But on the other hand, you're right too, because if it's only for the same persons and we can't reach others, it's a real problem. But can't we try and play with both, as having new kind of experiences in the museum, but that we can tell the same story on the network or on our website, so that other people, we can reach other people at the same time. Work on the two, with the two situations, the virtual one, and then it's global, and the one in the museum. But I have no real answers, but I'm asking myself exactly the same questions you were asking in a French museum.
So are you from a museum? You are from a museum?
Yes, yes. I'm the director of the Musée Cognac G, which is a little museum in Paris of a collector that gave his collection to Paris, and it's. No, I'm asking a lot of questions. I don't have all the answers. I have just arrived in this museum, so I'm very interested with all the. For the moment, we deal with. Having a website and all our, which is new for us, and you are example Nordic countries. We have all our images of our work of art on the website and free, which is open data, which is rare in France. And what I would like to do is everything that we put and try to do with mediation and the way we tell the story of our work of art in the museum, I would really have to have exactly more or less a copy on the website, that we will try and work at the same speed in the museum and for the global, that's all.
But isn't it quite interesting, though, that there is such a trust in the museum within this audience? We trust it. We think it's the most fantastic way of talking to people with. So how do we make it relevant? And I think if you have three ways, I mean, you either make it relevant because it's relevant for the citizens, which is a bit of a challenge because we need to change who we hire, who is working at the museum, who can actually identify themselves with the stories being told when we cannot tell them for them. Or you can go commercial and commercialize the museum in order to bring as much people as possible in, as they've done with the digital Van Gogh. Or you can digitalize and send it all around the world without having people coming to one house. But I think the house, the building itself, is super important today. It's even more important now than any before.
I think that's just heard the balance between the physical and the digital. Well, we have to do not one thing or the other, but both. So we have to do that. And I don't see any Chinese in this room that is not able to leave China. Right? But there might be some set generations here. At least there are some very young people. So can I ask some of the young people, what do you think about the digitalization now with art? Let's say over here. Would you like to express something? About experiencing art physically or digital?
Well, I'm also working in a museum of architecture. So in Paris too, so we are actually in the middle of this problematic, because architecture, normally you have to experience it physically, when you display some models, when you display some drawing, when you display some picture, you're always in a kind of mediation. It's not real architecture. So, of course, digital now enables us to create some new experiences which are closer to physical reality, because the scale, you talk about the human scale, that's what lack with the models, that's what is lacking with drawing. So we have a good dynamic between digital and physical. I think for architecture it's very relevant.
I would also say that, but I see what most cultural history museum does is actually making their collections accessible online, in order to stroll through all of the objects. And that is a way of making people interested and sharing these objects, and then maybe also invoking some kind of inspiration to come into the physical house. So that is how it's made. But to make a museum relevant, you say this is may also have that we have in more and more a task of bringing more people in as a museum at the physical place. We have the same problem in Denmark, or challenge, what you can call it, that the funding from the state became lesser, and they demanded for us to have more people coming through, paying for the visit. And that makes us, we have no other choice than to be more commercial. But I don't think that's a bad idea, because if you just make exhibitions for the ones who are interested in the first place, I think that you don't have, your task is not fulfilled, because you have to be, I'm working on a national museum. It's the national history of people, and not just national as in Denmark, but a European history, a global history. And it's our duty to bring that out to everybody. And if not everybody's coming to the museum, I'm not doing my job right. I have to know what the people want to see. And perhaps if I'm clever enough, I can get people who's not going to the museum come anyway, but then coming out of the museum with some of the ideas that I want to inspire them with. So it's also how you look at the task of curating a museum. And I think right now we are standing in a point of time where you have the digital world, you have the world of economies. The states are not just giving you money. That's not what the reality in Denmark is, that you have to earn your money more and more yourself. And then you also have to try to make the museum relevant and rethink the museum again and again. And we are really rethinking right now. Yeah.
We have a question over there. I just want to say that, don't forget, museums are tools. They're not the aim. Digitalization is not the aim, it's a tool, right? The collection is a tool. What is the aim? The aim is to create reflection, experiences, knowledge, but the museum is not the aim. It's not the aim to have as many people coming into the museum as possible. The aim is to create as much reflection, knowledge, experiences as possible. So it's a difference between where is the aim. So now we have a question, might be a different direction altogether.
Well, I'll catch up on it, because I'm also from Denmark, Copenhagen University, and I don't know how the discussion is in France, but in Denmark for quite some years, there's been only one way of measuring a success of a museum, namely how many people visit. And I realize that it's a very easy way of counting. And we really need, I'm an art historian, and I'm a researcher in curatorial studies and museum studies, and we really need to come up with other ways of measuring or qualifying what is a good exhibition, what is a good museum. And of course, I'm I'm not trying to promote this very elitist institution. I think it's very, very important to make the museum open and inviting for as many people as possible. But I think it's a sort of ridiculous thought that everyone should come in all museums, because that seems to be the way of measuring success right now. I mean, how would it be if in Denmark we said if not all people come to soccer games or football games, it's not important? I mean, of course it's important for the people who go there, and also maybe for other, and for museums. Well, that's... I don't have the answer of how to do this. I'll just mention that the Danish Cultural Foundation for some 10 years, I think it is now, correct me if I'm wrong, have been doing very thorough visitor interviews and studies of people who visit the museums. And they've collected so much information, and I hope this can be used in some ways to qualify other ways of measuring just the number of people. And it seems that, first of all, the museum has always been this special public space where you can have debates, you can reflect not just on your own, and what is so prominent, maybe you all know, but here we have it in hard numbers, that the majority, I think like 90% of visitors come not alone, but in different social groups. So it's per se a social event, and much more information can be said about that. I would like to also ask you a question, because I was really impressed and also a bit shocked by the new Munch Museum. I mean, it's maybe because I've just been talking about Louisiana and the way it was built, and it's so kind of modest architecture, impressing sight, but this Munch tower, it's kind of phallic and monumental. Sorry for being very, very banal, but why this enormous building? How did you say 30 floors? 13. 13 floors, and it's all a museum, the 13 floors? Oh my God.
Well, thank you for that. This museum is 60 meters tall. But in front of the museum, we invited the English artist, Tracy Emin, to create, she's a female artist, Munch is a male artist, to create a sculpture of 9 meters height in front of the museum. So it's a balance. 9 meters tall, the sculpture. Yeah, so it's smaller than the museum, I'm sorry. Okay, so I think it's a family of museums here. It's a lot of people from museum world, I guess. We did a research amongst young people in Norway, asked, what do you think about museums? And they said, we don't like the expression museums. Really? Right? So are anybody from outside of the museum world want to have a question? Everybody's from the museum world. It's one over there. Good.
Non, excusez-moi. Je parle en français.
I'm sorry. I come from the world of the industry, and I frequently go to... Can you hear the English translation? Hello, hello, is it working? So I come from the industry, and I, as a French person, can you hear me? Can you hear? The English channel is number 2, I think, yes. Can you hear the English? Hello? Can you hear the English? Yes? Okay. Good. So, as I said, I come from the industry. And as an average French person, I go to the museum from time to time. I go to thematic museums or general ones. And I came to this conference because I thought, hey, Nordic countries, for the French, we see them as socially advanced, we see that they have a good economy, that they have a high income per capita. So I wanted to know the vision of the Nordic country on museums, because here in Paris we see a museum that is not there to make exhibits, that is ostentatory with it's an empty building, but it's there just to it's for exhibits, and we don't really know what it is for. Well, this is my personal vision, but we don't really know. It's a void space, right? A huge space in the Bois de Boulogne, and we don't really know what it's for, except for a show-off. So I wanted to know, the history of your museums in a Nordic country, and I was interested in knowing what your policy was, or if there was any until now, and if there was one, how it changed now. And I thought everything we said was interesting, except for what you said. If I had replaced museum by the word supermarket or Disneyland, I would understand the same thing. I mean, I don't have enough visitors. My buildings are falling down. I need to maintain them. I have communication issues, and I have funding issues. And my building measures so and so. And, so you speak as us from the industry. So I am a bit puzzled, because you're all in a very specific environment, and you speak about your experiences, but personally, I did not understand what's new. You all spoke about your personal experiences, okay, but what's new? I'm sorry, I'm very critical.
You want something new, more than a new building. Yeah, I know. It says in the program. I know. Yeah.
First of all, I like to say that just to make to be more precise, young people in Norway didn't like the expression museum. Not museums, but the expression. So you have already some examples of Centre Pompidou. It doesn't say it's a museum. Tate Modern doesn't say it's a museum. So it's a little bit change. So we are called the Munch Museum. We are wondering, should we be Munch Museum or should we be only Munch or whatever? But to your question, yeah, there's a lot of new things happening, I think. First of all, not only the new museums, but the whole museum world is doing a lot more collaboration, in the sense that they are creating more relevance and more relationships to society. We have today 100 collaborators at the Munch Museum. They are coming from the business world, from the tourism world, travel world, from the cultural world, and from education. Why do we have this? Because we would like to be part of not only society, but we want the society to be part of us. So we want to have all these people coming in to help us decide who are we for whom, and decide how can we create programs that will be relevant for other people. And of course, we cannot ask people, what do you want, and then give it to them. Because I like to quote John Cage, who says, if you give people what they want, they already have it. So you don't want to do that. You want to give them something more. You want to give them something unexpected and something to reflect on. But still, you want to have this communication. So it's a total difference in the museum world now, and how they deal with museum, with the rest of society, in how they program, how they communicate, how they involve people from other sectors of society. So that's one big difference. And I think the other big difference,
Yeah, and if you can see, if there's something new, I can tell the museum I was presenting from Moscow, the new thing there was that you took a new building for something else that's really new in Scandinavia. And I also think All respect to Louvre, but it's still an old building. And that we created a museum for knowledge. It was a building built only for knowledge, and for knowledge to be presented, knowledge of who we are as human beings, being presented for 3 generations. So you can play, interact, get access to knowledge in a new way. And we cannot, the museum has to be rooted in something old in the history of museums. But we evolve in the way we display the objects, but it's still, I must say, that when you go into a museum hall, and this has been the same for hundreds of years, when you meet eye to eye with the object, something magical happens. And it doesn't have to be new for that to arise, but the surroundings and the way you present it makes people stay there longer. Normally, with the museum we had before, people went through in less than an hour. Now they stay for 6 hours. What happens in these 6 hours? They engage. We have made inspiring surroundings that make people stay. And that's also what I see in your museums that we're working with, is how can you create spaces where you can be free of thought, learn something new, and be inspired. And one of the things that you can measure it, not by the numbers coming in, but how long people are staying. Are they being entertained? I think that's really important.
Thank you. Maybe I'll make an end quote, since we're all standing here now. I think you're right. There's nothing new to it. We're all discussing this all the time. I mean, we're constantly negotiating our identity. We constantly, since we've been building museums, and National Museum in particular, we've been negotiating who we are and what we want to be. So I agree with you. There's nothing new to it, but it's a new scale to it, and it's a new commercial interest to it, and there's a new expectation to it. And it comes down to a lot to do with visitor numbers, which is a very boring thing to talk about. But I think if you're going to, because the museum as a form is so specific, it is a collection that grows. It is acquisitions, new works coming in, and it is the mediation of the works that the building itself, the people, and the visitors are doing together. So I think we are coping with the question of technology as one would do 100 years ago. It's just that the idea of technology was different. And making ourselves relevant is just as important now as it was 100 years ago. It's just that we constantly need to have this discussion. And today, I think, we're a multi-ethnic society. We really need to rethink who we hire, how we hire, who's telling the story, who owns the story of Munch. You don't need to be Norwegians to own that story, and you're saying that as well as the axe, as well as we know the Vikings were trading so much. I mean, things have always been moving, and the museums have to do too. So, yeah, I think it was a good comment. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll have some more maybe comments and questions. But one more thing I think is a very big difference today that happens at least very much in our country, contemporary art. When I grew up, contemporary art was for somebody special. It was a niche. People went to special places for contemporary art, and it was just a few people going there. And I remember from contemporary music that people said, if you think somebody's sitting behind you at a contemporary music concert, you are paranoid. Today, every museum needs to relate to contemporary art, need a contemporary artist. You said also contemporary artist at the Historic Museum. So there is a total difference in the attitude to what's happening in the arts right now. Contemporary art, contemporary voices, they are present everywhere in the museum world. It didn't used to be like that. So at the Munch Museum, we have a strong contemporary program. Didn't exist 10 years ago, 5 years ago. Now it exists. And this is happening, at least in all the Nordic museums, I would say. You have this very strong connection to contemporary art, and it's also having the same kind of tendency, I think, also in the rest of the world. Okay, so are there more comments or questions, or are you ready for a glass of wine or something?
Let's go out in the sun.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming. Great seeing you. Great discussions. Bye-bye then. Thank you.